We're back now at the PowerShift Summit 2.0 for a conversation focused on the view from the EEOC, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And leading the conversation today and introducing our speakers is Mizell Stewart. Mizell is a veteran news executive and newsroom leader and an outstanding educator. He is Senior Director of Talent, Partnerships, and News Strategy for Gannett and the USA Today Network. Welcome, Mizell, and welcome, guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And before we begin our discussion, we'd like to take a moment to introduce the PowerShift Project's Workplace Integrity Training. This is a curriculum specifically developed for news organizations by our own Jill Geisler. And as we'll discuss in a few minutes, training can play a critical role in creating workplaces that are free from discrimination and harassment. Here's a video overview of the Workplace Integrity Curriculum with information on how you or your media organization can become involved.
The Workplace Integrity Curriculum is custom designed for media organizations, not just for journalists, but for all media employees who want their workplaces to be environments free of harassment, discrimination, and incivility, but filled with opportunity, especially for those who've traditionally been denied it. That's Workplace Integrity. The three-part course is interactive and lively. It respects the experience and expertise of the participants, whether seasoned veterans or student interns. It's built on three pillars: critical thinking, courageous conversations, and culture of respect and trust. During all three modules, staffers work in teams. They talk together, think out loud, and find the comfort to have the kind of conversations we just don't usually have at work. Each module has its own exercises, analyzing things we've heard or said at work for their accuracy, assumptions, bias, logic, and alternatives. Speaking up in challenging workplace situations, proactively and reactively. Using practical case studies to role play and practice. Building a workplace culture of respect and trust by showing what it takes, the values, skills, tools, systems, and assumptions, and showing what each one looks like in everyday behaviors and choices. After each module, participants download their takeaways both for themselves and for their organization. They set personal goals, things they'll work on, who their allies will be, and how they'll measure success. And in the culture exercise, they use a matrix that spreads and shares responsibility for respect and trust across individuals, teams, and the company. With this foundation of their own ideas and solutions, they build workplace integrity. Environments free of harassment, discrimination, and incivility, but filled with opportunity, especially for those who've traditionally been denied it. The faces you've seen belong to the inaugural class of Workplace Integrity Trainers, all of whom experience the training as they learn to deliver it back home. And because the Workplace Integrity Curriculum was selected to receive a major grant from CBS, qualified organizations now send staff free of charge with subsidized travel to the PowerShift's Train the Trainer workshops for workplace integrity.
We did not recognize CBS for its generous gift to the Freedom Forum Institute to make this training available to media organizations across the country. And so you'll see on the slide the schedule for workshops that are upcoming in 2019. And so please get in touch with the Freedom Forum Institute and they'll be able to get you connected with the program. Now on to our conversation. And I emphasize that, that this is a conversation. So Sharif is back as well as Julie. And what we will ask of you is that we're not going to have a formal Q&A in this session. We are going to have a conversation. If you wish to contribute to the conversation, and it doesn't have to be a question. It can be a response. It can be a comment in relation to what we're talking about with Vicki and Hai. Please give Sharif or Julie the high sign. They will come over with the microphone. What I would ask is just wait to be recognized so that we make sure that the crew can capture your question, and we'll be off. Sound good? And so let me introduce our guests. Vicki Lipnic is the acting chair of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and Hai Feldblum is a former commissioner on the EEOC, and Vicki and Hai were the co-chairs of the EEOC Select Task Force on the Study of Harassment in the Workplace. This was a comprehensive report that came out in 2016, and there was a particular date in October where your report literally took off. Vicki, I'd like to turn first to you to understand the landscape. You know, what changed? What has changed since that fateful date in October?
Sure. And first of all, many thanks to the PowerShift Project for inviting me to be with you today and to have the chance to be with my, she will always be my colleague. I will still refer to her as Commissioner Feldblum, but mostly my friend, Hai Feldblum. So October 5th, 2017 is just emblazoned on my forehead. But before that, 18 months before that, as Mizell said, Hai and I had co-chaired a task force at the EEOC. We issued our report in June of 2016. And our study on harassment in the workplace was born out of our interest and a concern at the leadership level at the EEOC that we were seeing this persistent and pervasive problem in our workplaces, and we at the EEOC needed to do something different to speak to that. So we impaneled this task force, outside experts. When we issued our report in June of 2016, that was almost to the day, the 30th anniversary of the landmark Supreme Court decision in the Meritor Savings Bank case, which was the first case to recognize that sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination and protected under Title VII of the Civil Rights Law. So we were looking at, 30 years later, we think there's still a problem. And there need to be some different approaches, and we really wanted to look at prevention. On October 5th, 2017, when the Harvey Weinstein story broke, to say that we have been all harassment all the time is a bit of an understatement. And so among the things that have changed, I mean, the most immediate thing was at the EEOC, within the first month, we had a 5-fold increase in hits to our website of people looking for information about harassment and about the law and whatever information that the EEOC had available. Our fiscal year at the Commission runs from October 1st to September 30th, so I tell everyone it sort of nicely coincides with when the New York Times and others first reported the Weinstein story. So in addition to all of this, everyone looking for more information, over the past year, so 2018, we did see a significant increase in people filing charges with the EEOC of harassment. So in a year when overall charges of discrimination declined in terms of people filing charges at the EEOC, and that decline was about 9% in terms of charges being filed, we had a 13.6% increase in the number of charges being filed on harassment. So that was pretty significant. I mean, certainly that is a willingness of people to speak up and to really take on the system. By the time someone comes to the EEOC to file a charge, things are really broken. And the fact that they're looking for redress from the EEOC speaks volumes, and that more people were willing to speak up when we know so many people do not report internally in the first place.
And we'll get into the process of the EEOC in a bit, but Hai, you have observed in the past that 70% of people who experience workplace harassment never say anything. Why is that, and is that changing given all that has transpired over the last year?
Well, I think it's changing some, but probably not enough. And let me just say first this one point about when we talk about really changing the structures of our workplace to stop and prevent harassment. We must talk about harassment on all bases. Our task force report was not a select task force in the study of sexual harassment. It was a study of harassment in the workplace. Without a doubt, it is important that the high-level stories about sexual harassment has caught the attention of the country. I mean, if you had asked me in June 2016, what's the biggest roadblock to implementing the recommendations of our report, I would have said, getting people's attention. Okay, we have people's attention. And all of you in this audience have been a huge part of that. And we have the range of social actors focused, not just employers and employees, and government agencies, but foundations and community groups, religious groups, the media, the ordinary person on the street, right? And the question is how we're going to leverage this moment into significant and sustainable change in workplaces, as well as other places. So when we are thinking about the structures to put in place to enable people to come forward, to feel safe, because that's why they don't report, because they don't feel safe. They don't feel safe in how, when they come to report, how they're going to be treated, and they don't feel safe about what's going to happen to them. Are they going to be protected after they're reported? The solutions employers put in place to deal with that are the same solutions, whether it's sex-based harassment or race-based or disability or religion. So let's do that. And I think I said this morning, oh my God, this panel before was awesome. I did tweet from @Feldblum, if you're not following me yet. Fascinating and helpful conversation. But it was interesting because you sort of went back and forth between talking about like a sexual harassment task force group and remember intersectionality, or not just intersectionality. It's not just black women who get harassed, it's black men, right? Every time you think that you're just saying sexual harassment, whether it's training or a group, just stop, pause, say, why am I not doing this harassment wide? Because a lot of the solutions in terms of representation, trust, they're going to go across the board. So people don't complain, don't come forward because they're afraid, how they'll be treated when they come forward, whether they'll be protected. That's in the hands of the workplace about how those two things are dealt with.
I'm glad you broadened the discussion in talking about harassment in all forms. And I think that really is the core of the concept of workplace integrity that the PowerShift project is all about. And I will never forget a conversation that I had with the CEO of the EW Scripps Company at the time. I had just become a senior executive in a media organization for the first time, and was sitting down with Rich Bainey. And one thing he said during that conversation stuck with me, and still to this day. He said, something you have to understand. We follow the no asshole rule here. And Carrie mentioned that earlier in the context of Politico, but I can't emphasize enough the power that getting that message from the CEO sent when it came to how I went about my job every day. Talk a little bit more about the role of setting the tone from the top about what will not be tolerated.
Yeah, so you know how you always hear, it starts at the top. And I'm like, okay, thank you for sharing. What exactly does that mean? In a concrete manner. And the point about the task force, we spent about 2 months picking the people for the task force, and we picked equal numbers of lawyers representing employers and lawyers representing employees, so we could create a safe space for them to talk to each other, and academics. Sociology, psychology, organizational behavior, so they could bring the lessons they've learned from years of research. And what they were able to bring is really concrete information about what it means to have leadership. Because it is all about workplace culture. You can have the best policies and procedures in the world, and if you don't have the right workplace culture, it's not going to matter. And the research shows that leaders can shape workplace culture. But it needs 3 things. Leaders, number 1, have to believe that something is wrong. They have to believe that it's bad to have assholes in the workplace, whether it's about those harassing others or those just treating others with disrespect. So they have to believe it. They have to articulate those values and their expectations. Do not underestimate the power of words, whether it's orally speaking at the beginning of some open all-staff meeting on something else, starting with, this is the culture we expect. And actions. You know, leaders say a lot of things. Employees have to believe that their leaders are being authentic. And the way they believe that is based on the actions that the leaders take. The fact that that person said that to you, told you, that leader had your back. If you came and said, we got to talk to this person, or if it's bad enough, we got to move the person out. And it also communicated to you that he wanted you to be responsible if there was someone acting inappropriately, that you had the courage to, in fact, do something.
And you're exactly right, is that is such an empowering statement, because there are times, no matter what level of leadership you're in, where you wonder, if you bring this up,
Right.
Are other people in the organization going to have my back? So how do you have that conversation before you need to?
Before you need to with your leadership?
Exactly. In other words, it's one thing to have that conversation when you've got an issue right in front of you. It's another thing to have that conversation and say, if this happens, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it?
Well, that's one of the things that I certainly hope and believe has changed over the past year and a half in all of the reporting and all of the information about this, is we really are in a different environment, and we have to capitalize on it. So now, rather than leaders in whatever workplace waiting until they've got a situation on their hands that they feel like they need to go to their higher-ups about, organizations now, as Hai said, because it is all about culture, should now be focusing on, okay, what do we know about our culture? Have we assessed our culture? Have we done a climate assessment? And they should be asking those questions now and having those conversations among the leadership team about, all right, how are we going to handle situations? Or what do we know about what we want to do differently? Or do we have examples of things that have happened in the past, so that you are prepared when those situations come up. One of the important recommendations that we made in our task force report, and as Hai said, this was our group of experts who led us to this, was that if you are going to inform and train no one else in your workplace, you have got to train the first line supervisors so that they know how to respond when someone comes to them, or that they are empowered to, when they are observing something that is inappropriate, they know what to do. If that group of people does not know what to do, then things will go off the rails pretty quickly.
So I want to add something, and I haven't thought about this analogy until you asked this question. So I spent 18 years as a law professor at Georgetown Law School, and it was always clear that you should have expectations established ahead of time. Right? It wasn't a good idea when you were voting on tenure for someone to now say, oh, well, that's our expectation and you didn't fill it. Okay, you don't want to have that conversation with regard to a particular person. You want to give thought ahead of time about what your expectations are and how people will behave. And it's very important, and we stress this in the report, that when there's corrective action taken against someone who hasn't behaved consistently with your expectations, that it's proportionate discipline. Right? I mean, if something is egregious and all the person gets is a slap on the wrist, that sends your clearest message that you're not really being authentic. But conversely, you're trying to stop bad behavior before it rises to really bad behavior. There's a lot of behavior that doesn't deserve termination. People need to know that there's a series of corrective action. It's one of the reasons we caution against the term zero tolerance policy, which so many employers love to use. What we like about that is conveying that there's zero tolerance for any level of unwelcome behavior that makes you uncomfortable. Doesn't have to be illegal, okay? But it doesn't mean that every type of misconduct will get the same response of termination. I mean, that could even chill reporting, because people often don't want their coworker to be fired. They just want the conduct to stop. So you want to communicate clearly, here are our expectations, and here's what happens if you contravene those expectations.
Now, I'm going to make a request of all of you before I go into this next question, which is I want to ask you to think about how you might be able to add to the conversation on this question. What has changed in terms of the nature of the conversations in your workplaces around the culture that you want to have? Mm-hmm. So think about that while we go into this question. And I guess for the benefit of people who are really new to this conversation, what are some of the risk factors when it comes to organizational culture, organizational behavior that have the potential to contribute to a culture of harassment? Vicki?
Sure. So first of all, I do have to make a pitch for our task force report, because I tell everyone since June of 2016, but really since October of 2017, I never leave home without a copy of this. So wherever I go. So one of the things that we did in our series of recommendations was there's a whole section at the end of our report that's an appendix of risk factors. And again, this was based on our research and the testimony that we heard from other witnesses. So, among things that we listed as risk factors, workplaces where some employees do not conform to the workplace norms, so that can be in terms of dress, for example. If it's a workplace that there's a lack of diversity in the workplace, cultural and language differences. If you have a significant number of young people in a workplace, that can often be a risk factor. Workplaces where there are significant power disparities, and workplaces with high-valued employees. And I put high value in quotes, because that was one of the things that we called out in our report, which we refer to as the superstar harasser. And by superstar, we don't mean, like all of you who are in the media, stars in that way. We mean the highly valued employee in a workplace. So it could be the professor who gets all the grant money, the lawyer who brings in all the clients, the salesperson who has the off-the-chart sales figures, the surgeon. Someone who for many, many years, the workplace, the organization knows is a superstar. And they contribute to the bottom line in a significant way to that workplace and to that organization. But the workplace has tolerated a lot of behavior that for a long time they knew was going on, or they certainly had suspicions of behavior going on. And the superstar harasser is something, like I said, that we called out. Now that, I think there has been, certainly we've seen, certainly in the media, right, a lot of really quick change on that type of harasser. I think a lot of other organizations, because of what many organizations are now factoring in about their reputational risk, are also making the same change. So
Well,
those are among the risk factors.
And how you looked at the superstar syndrome, I thought you've had a really neat explanation about the cost-benefit calculation. And the cost-benefit calculation in many cases before the events of the last year, year plus, was often in favor of the harasser and not biased toward the person who was the target of harassment. Do you see that cost-benefit calculation has changed and is the swiftness, for example, of Matt Lauer, leaving the Today Show, but it was clear that this is behavior that was well known, at least in some aspects of the network, for a very long time. Almost a switch has flipped, it would seem.
Well, I think it's flipped in some respects and not in others. I mean, you certainly heard that in the first panel, right? This is a work in progress. I certainly expect there to be another one, Power Summit, a year from now. I think it's changed in some respects because of the people understanding the reputational risk. But if you looked at the cost-benefit analysis that employers were making up until this point, if you had someone who was of high value and someone brought a complaint, it just seemed that the cost of getting rid of or even disciplining the high-value person was way higher than the cost of just getting rid of the person, paying the person off or just firing the person. And I think that cost-benefit analysis is beginning to change, but there are high-value employees all through the levels of an organization, right? If you're an editor and you've got 4 reporters, 6 reporters who are your team, and you've got 1 reporter who's just phenomenally great in terms of productivity and makes you look good, and then that's your superstar in your little space. And then you get a complaint from someone who you don't think is a great producer. What are you going to try to do? It really is. This is why people diminish and trivialize some of these complaints, because they'd rather get rid of the complainer than the someone who's producing. And that is just a bad cost-benefit analysis. I mean, the research actually shows that keeping a toxic worker in the workplace, no matter how high value, has adverse consequences that are significant. Maybe the other people would be more productive if that person wasn't doing the behavior he or she is engaging in. So it's beginning to change. I think that there needs to be more. I mean, it's interesting. I would say there are 3 things in our report that were absolutely new that I've not seen in other places. One was making the business case for an employer stopping harassment. And it was one of the management lawyers on the task force who said, this would be so useful if you put this together. Because companies think about the direct financial costs of defending against an EEOC charge or defending against litigation. And literally some of them in their budget, just in their risk thing, they put, okay, litigation costs, done. We have insurance. And what we brought up from the research were all this indirect financial costs. Impact on health effects, impact on job turnover, which is the hugest impact, because it's not only the target of harassment who leaves, often even not for a better job, but just leaves, but people who see harassment going on around them unchecked, and they know another company has a good reputation, they will leave also. And because almost 70% of people do not report, you don't even know why that person left, unless you happen to have exit interviews and people happen to be honest. And then, of course, the reputational cost. So that was one, really explaining the business case. The second thing was pulling together these risk factors. Again, if you want to be proactive, show that leadership, it's worth looking at the risk factors. The risk factor doesn't mean that there will be harassment. Just because they're young workers doesn't mean there'll be harassment. But it creates potential breeding ground for it. So there are ideas about how to deal with that proactively. One of the ones that I think, and again, and it was mentioned in the first panel, decentralized workplaces. You know, you could have a great HR department, even a great culture that you've started to develop at headquarters, but you got to get out to all the places. You know, big retail companies, thousands of stores. I heard this from folks in Hollywood. Yeah, and then people go out on location, and they're all stressed. You got to figure out proactively, if you have decentralized workplaces, what's going to be your strategy?
Well, and I could just add on that. I mean, that's one of the things that we've both been, preaching on this for the past 2 years. And to your point about the leaders, you need to have an arm's length assessment of where do my employees go to work every day, right? Because if you're a big organization, you have employees in all kinds of different locales. So a newsroom is different from a retail establishment, is different from a trucking company, is different from, do you have employees who are working in isolated situations? And you really have to assess, where is my entire workforce going to work every day?
And media organizations in many ways are microcosms of that larger world. I mean, there are places in media organizations, where there's a trucking operation.
Sure.
There are places in media organizations where, folks are working at all hours of the day and night, and, not in necessarily the most secure locations or places where there are a lot of other people around to witness things that are going on. So leadership has to be pretty vigilant. But back to all of you, how has the conversation changed in your organizations over the past year?
I think there's one over here.
Just have one question for, twice it was mentioned about, as part of the risks, having younger staffers. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Where is that data coming from? Mm-hmm. And the second question on that is, do you see a difference on how younger generations see harassment or deal with it than traditional workforces?
Yeah. So, number one, on data, it's interesting. We have a lot of good survey data on sex-based harassment. And one of the things we need is, we have tons of surveys on discrimination against African Americans and other people of color, but they don't necessarily have a pull-out question on harassment. Okay, we really need to dig down on these other grounds. But, in terms of some of the risk factors, this is why I say this is really new to our report, because we just went out and talked to people. And people who'd been doing this for 30 years, doing investigations. So in a way, we're bringing their life experiences. But of course, it's also intuitive. And there are a few reasons why it's a problem. Obviously, young workers can feel more disempowered. Okay, we heard some of that this morning in terms of interns, et cetera. But young workers often don't know what the expectations are. This is often their first job. They don't know what's okay or not okay. And then often in places like retail or fast food places, the manager is 25 years old, right? The manager is a young person. So the manager does not necessarily understand how he or she needs to deal with these situations and be held accountable. So, to me, I actually think we should be getting into the high schools. We should be getting into the colleges. It's about preparing people before they walk in. One of the other things, though, in terms of then how people view it, I think they're much more aware of the online harassment. I think some of them have experienced that, the trolling, and really, and I'm not sure they were told before, that's not okay. To sort of say in the workplace, at least, that's not okay. And we will have your back if this is happening to you. It's okay, even if you have it, it's on Facebook. You know, it's not the company's email, but it's on Facebook. But if what is said on Facebook ends up affecting you at the workplace, that matters.
Let's go over here.
Hi, I'm Karen Hansen with the Radio, Television, Digital News Association. We work with primarily local broadcast newsrooms. So one aspect of this conversation that really applies to our audience is the number of middle managers. You know, you've got a lot of small newsrooms where there's one editor working for a newscast. The other thing that applies to our audience a lot is having teams in a lot of different places. In the field, maybe on their own. So a lot of these issues are really relevant. So we've been trying to change the conversation for our members in a few different ways. One of them is shifting from punitive to really proactive. We've been trying to talk about some of these more underlying issues. Some of them are things like, how do we value the diverse voices we might already have in our newsrooms? We've talked a lot about the diversity isn't there yet. We do a lot of research on that every year. But we've also tried to add to the conversation how to really value and embrace the diverse voices that you do have. We've talked about things like caring for the whole person in your newsroom. Trauma has come up today. We've talked about how managers can help their teams and themselves cover traumatic stories differently and recognize the mental health issues that might come along with that. We've talked about things like working moms in TV news and how much that's a challenge. So again, the way that we're trying to shift the conversation is talk about really at the micro level, what are some of the workplace culture issues that we can get to, that if we can move the needle on those, we can prevent harassment and discrimination across all levels.
Thank you for sharing that, because those are very important points, particularly in broadcast news, given the size of many newsrooms, you know, the isolation I think at times leaders in those newsrooms feel, and having an organization such as yours to provide that support is very important.
Can I just add one point along those lines? First of all, I commend you for having these sort of broader conversations, and you know that's all about respect, right? And it's about respecting people. So. And understanding, you know, what it is that people are bringing to the workplace and the situations that they're dealing with, and that, you know, is certainly a part of the conversation about preventing harassment. The other thing that I would add, when we mentioned about, you know, not wanting to focus on punitive, as Hai said, one of the things we talked about in the report was, you know, people who don't want to report. Part of the reason they don't want to report is because they actually don't want the person to get fired. They want some, you know, what most of the people want who are experiencing harassment is for the behavior to stop. They don't want to lose their job themselves. They don't want to have to move on. They want the person to stop harassing them. And so the more you are communicating things that not everything is going to be punitive, but we are going to address these things, I think that's a worthwhile conversation and a way to address some of this.
I'm Lauren Mayer with NPR. I just wanted, your question was, how are you trying to change the conversation? And so we've been trying to do it in a number of ways, and I don't pretend to say that any of these are best practices, but just to share some of the things that we've tried to do in our organization. So one is, you know, the topic of training came up, and we've done anti-harassment training that's in person, where we really do role play. So a little bit to the point you made about trying to have the conversation before you need it, to imagine a scenario and then talk it through, has been, I think, very helpful. One of the things that the firm we used was a very, very simple rubric of red, yellow, green. You know, what kind of things are red, yellow, and green, and it seems really silly, but it does give you a really easy way, a shorthand later on, to be like, I don't know, that seemed a little yellow, and then you just sort of cut right through to the chase, and so that's been helpful. One of the things that I thought was important as we thought about conversations about values in a journalism organization was I was very concerned that if we tried to initiate something from the top down, that it was just going to be met with a lot of resistance, that, if we had some team that identified words and then we put stickers on them, that just was not going to be effective. And so what we've done is actually, with Jill's help, had her work with individual desks and teams in the newsroom at a pretty sort of micro level, talk about what are our obligations as this team to each other, and what are the obligations we think that the company has to us, as a way to try to start a conversation at a more local level, that we hopefully we do enough of those, we'll be able to see themes that come up. And then we've tried to have a little bit more maybe top-down or centralized things. So Keith Woods, who works with me, is here. One of the things that came up in our climate survey was a general feeling of inequity. And so he's leading a bunch of conversations around the topic of fairness in general, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out of those and what we do. And then lastly, I send a weekly note every Friday about what we're doing to improve workplace culture. Somebody's asked me if I looked at the open rates, and I haven't. So I can't say that it's a must-read in the organization, but I think at a minimum, it's a statement every week that these things matter and that we're focused on them and that we're not going to forget about them.
Right. Actually, I want to add something, I think, specifically about what NPR has done, and then sort of generally in terms of some of the other comments. I remember like 9 months ago, whenever it was, because you had the law firm of Morgan Lewis come in to basically investigate your investigations, what happened and why. And I think collected a lot of useful information, and that report was public. It was something I could read and see what an organization had done proactively. And then from that report saying, okay, based on what we found, what do we do? And the peer-to-peer stuff is excellent. I mean, but there has to be trust, and that's clearly what you're doing. I think the other thing I want to say in terms of training, and sort of picking up on something that you noted, training is essential, but it's the capstone effort, right? It's not the primary effort. It's not the only effort. It's the capstone effort, right? Once you have leadership, once you have accountability, you're really keeping people accountable. And that means someone who, after a full and fair investigation, has been found to have engaged in misconduct, that there's proportionate response. You're holding accountable the managers, first-line supervisors, whoever it is that you've designated to take in complaints, HR, that they have responded seriously to the complaints. I hate when people say, oh, don't talk to HR, they're not your friend. They work for the employer. I'm like, yeah. And the employer is saying to them, the way you help me is to take complaints seriously. But to hold the managers, HR, et cetera, accountable and have their back when they do something. And then hold accountable anyone who retaliates. Okay, that's accountability. And then clear policies, clear procedures, and then training. That's the capstone. And additional point about training, we talk about 3 different types of training in the report. So compliance training, respectful workplaces training, and then bystander intervention training. And this is back, the compliance is about expectations, right? It's basically saying, this is what you need to comply with when you come to work. I mean, we got it because one of the members of our task force said, it's not training to change your mind, it's training to keep your job. Or not to be disciplined.
Yeah, because you're not just going to change someone's mind through a webinar,
Or even a live trainer. In 2 hours, the person who says, why can't I tell Susan she looks sexy in that dress? And my wife loves it when I say that. And you're like, great, go home, tell that to your wife, might need to tell it to her more, but when you walk in the doors of this workplace, that's not acceptable. So that's sort of foundational. But afterwards, what we really found, the researcher who said uncivil behavior can be a gateway drug to illegal harassment. Just have people learn, and this is very skills-based training, the respectful workplaces, learn how to give feedback when someone does something that's disrespectful, really concretely, and then give people the skills on how to respond when they get that type of feedback. I mean, neither of those are easy for us as human beings.
And that's, one reason why the workplace integrity curriculum with the PowerShift project has what Jill calls courageous conversations,
Right,
because it's how do you give people the tools to initiate the conversations that need to happen so that that culture of incivility does not take root.
And by the way, that's why you then need, as the third piece, the bystander intervention. Because given the power dynamics, you might not feel comfortable saying something, but someone else who sees it, who's more on the same power level, afterwards can say, you know what, Jack? I think that might have made her uncomfortable. Because remember, we talked about just
Well, and
empowering
I was just going to add back to where we started. You said among the things that have changed. Among the things that have changed is that there is a lot more thought and innovation being given to training, right? The part of where we started in our task force work was, okay, people have been doing this harassment training for 30 years and it's not working. So what's the problem here? And as Hai said, we didn't say, and for the EEOC to take such a critical look at training was really unusual, because when we settle cases in harassment, the first thing we ask for is training. So that was really, a little bit of a risk factor for us in terms of saying, wait a minute, there needs to be some different thought given here. And so the example of, the PowerShift training, the respectful workplaces, we developed a curriculum on our own, all of the things like you're talking about that NPR is doing, where people, who are the ones, it's not, as you said, not top-down driven, but bottom-up. All of those things make a difference. And a lot of that, for 30 years, it just became sort of this by rote. We have to do this to protect ourselves against the liability. And okay, people have their annual harassment training and we're done. And the more there has been, I think, conversations and real genuine efforts at what needs to change, I think that's been a big change that we've seen over the past year and a half, and I hope will make a big difference.
Okay. We'll come over here to Sharif and then to Julie.
Thanks. I'm Elisa Liz-Munoz with the International Women's Media Foundation. I wanted to respond to the question about if younger people are seeing these issues differently, because from our network of female journalists, we are seeing a generational divide, and I think it's really important for managers to recognize that. I think even women managers or women in sessions that we've gone to in panels like this, there's a real divide in terms of younger women want to see institutional change. And older women, we have noticed, take a much more individualized perspective of, I'm going to solve this problem myself, put your head down, work hard, suck it up, all of the cliches that go along with, a rugged journalist. But what we have noticed is that younger female journalists are not okay with that approach. And this plays out online when women complain and then get attacked by other women who just think that they should just suck it up. So I think it's really important to recognize that that divide exists so that it can be addressed.
Thank you for that.
In the spirit of institutional change, though I do not happen to be a journalist, 2 questions for the panel in the room. The first is, how do you see internal research and evaluation playing a role in the accountability you've been discussing? And secondly, how do you see research and evaluation playing a role in improving the outcomes of the types of trainings we've been discussing?
And your first question was, how does research affect the
influence the accountability we have to each other in making
Oh.
these goals?
Influence of accountability. I just actually want to say something first to Alyssa's point, because I just think that's so interesting. And for those of you who are interested, Professor Kathleen Gerson who's a sociologist, has done some really interesting work, and she talks about changing individuals resistant institutions, about how individuals actually still want change, including maybe institutional change, but the institutions are resistant. And she actually found at least a distinction between young men and young women. So when she asked questions like, and this was about, in a sense, workplace flexibility. You know, the men absolutely equally to the women wanted to share caretaking responsibilities. They were there. When they were asked the question, well, what if you couldn't? You know, what if the company didn't allow it? The men at much higher numbers said, well, we would support our wife going part-time. And the women were saying, well, I would just try to figure it out. You know, so, we do need the institutional change. And the way to make the institutional change is from the top, right? And mentioning Kathleen Gerson, I think, goes precisely to your point about the importance of research. There's a lot of data out there that we can use already, and there's a lot of data we don't have. And for example, on training, I sat for a month and I read literally every social science article that there was on training. Okay, I did that so you didn't have to. Okay, and we have the little, 1 page. And my chief of staff, Sharon Masley, I literally wrote that section 3 times because she kept saying, no, too much detail, But over and over, there was only, of all those studies, one researcher who had actually gotten into an employer and could look at the situation before and after real training. In other words, a lot of simulations, employers have got to feel comfortable with allowing researchers to come in, do the data analysis before. Let's do the same type of training and interventions at 5 different employers so that data can be aggregated, anonymous. That would be huge. And
Hi, you're a lawyer. What is that the fear? Is that the roadblock? Legal, employers not wanting to, peel back the curtain because they're afraid of some type of liability?
I cannot tell you the number of times we've both heard of the HR person has this great idea. We're going to do a cultural assessment survey. We're going to, find this out. And the general counsel is like, "Nyet, no," because they're afraid, they're afraid if they do it. I actually think there is some barrier if they never get the information back from the researcher, because what they're afraid of is it being discoverable in litigation. Someone's bringing an actual complaint, and then they say, oh, well, look what you had in your cultural assessment, and clearly you had a problem. And
you knew about it 4 years ago.
Well, right, if the complaint is 4 years afterwards. What we are saying, it's the cost-benefit analysis. Do you want to know or do you not want to know? Okay? Because, again, your whole workforce will be more productive if you actually know and then you take steps to mitigate that. And maybe you also won't get the complaint.
Yeah, I think that's really the key. One of the things I love about our company, Gannett and USA Today Network, is that we do annual surveys of each business unit and their culture. We do a quarterly survey talking about employee engagement, and our people, have the opportunity to evaluate, is leadership walking the walk. And I can't tell you, though, how rare doing that on a routine basis is, and I think that fear factor does tend to inhibit the gathering of data that you can really that's really actionable, that you can go in and really try to change the culture in a positive direction.
Well, and then as you know, as a leader, the other thing is that the leaders have to actually take the time to look at that assessment and analyze. So we are all awash in data. But you've got to take the time to look at the information that you have, to your point about, can it make some institutional change, and assess it. And so if, a company takes the time to say, well, actually, let's go back and look over the last 5 years. How many complaints have we had of harassment, and what's been the nature of them? You certainly are going to know if it's been the superstar harasser, if it's been one person who has, there are repeated complaints against. But you want to look broadly about what's the nature of the complaints, where are they coming from, and, understand your organization. And that can make a real difference then in terms of if you do the kinds of things, to then address those things, how you want to address the culture.
Blissful ignorance is not going to
Not a good way to go. No,
not gonna
definitely
fix it.
not.
We have Keith Woodsey. Hi, Keith Woods from NPR. So I wanted to wait a little while and let this conversation go a bit before I ask this question, because I know that when I have these conversations on fairness that Lauren mentioned earlier, it will come up much sooner and possibly derail discussions. But I know that there are people in my organization who feel that when we ask the question about fairness, now they think it's switched, and it's not really a good place if you're a man, and it's not really a good place if you're a white person in the organization, because so much has happened to the contrary over the course of the last year. Part of me wants to just roll my eyes and move on, but I believe that there is a need for us to engage somewhere in that discussion, and my question is, what does that look like? What does that engagement look like from where you're sitting?
We have to move all of us forward together, right? I mean, that's essential. The whole point about doing respectful workplaces training as opposed to anti-harassment training, even on all bases, is to start with what type of workplace do we all want, right? We want to be treated with respect. I mean, white Christian men can have situations where they're not being treated with respect.
Absolutely.
You know, we want a culture of respect. And, you know, within it, you also say there are certain things that are illegal. And by the way, it's illegal to harass a white man as much as it is to harass a black man, or, you know. But here are the things that are illegal. But here's how we're going to treat if there is a complaint. And conscious of the time, there are two things I really want to say. And because you can always, you reporters know, you can always wrap that into any question that's asked. So I want to say something about transparency and about taking people seriously. Because the most important thing about any procedure you have set up is that you will take people seriously and ensure there's not retaliation. That includes someone who's been accused and it's not true, right? But taking people seriously when they come forward means saying, thank you. Thank you for coming forward. If what you say is happening, it's wrong, and we will do something about it. And here are the next steps. It's not taking the allegation as true right off the bat. That's what the full and fair investigation is for. So I think you have to convey, we're trying to create a respectful workplace on all bases. When people come forward, we will take them seriously, but it's going to be full and fair. And then comes the next thing on transparency. You know, the person from APU said, you know, from HR we always say, we got it. Thank you for coming forward, and we've dealt with it. And we don't discuss personnel issues. That's not a good idea, okay? And as a lawyer, I will tell you that if you find that someone is engaged in harassment, egregious enough that you have fired the person, and you tell that to the employees, as Carolyn said, there's a hunger for transparency from employees, and you say it, the truth is a defense to a defamation suit. Yeah, maybe someone will sue, although that's a decision on their part to really raise the profile. But how much more important it is to have people know what happened. And to wrap back to what you said, if someone comes forward with a complaint, and because you've told the men in your office, do not deal with this by saying, I'll only have meetings with women with the door open and with men with the door closed. Okay, you want to get the EEOC at your door for plain old discrimination? Go ahead and do that. Okay? So you don't want to be doing that. But if then someone brings a complaint and you've investigated and you have found there isn't a basis for it, you make that very clear to the person who's complained, to the person who's been accused. And again, you don't need corroborative witnesses necessarily. There are credibility determinations that are made, but sometimes you just either can't determine it or you determine, no, that person had a vendetta against you and decided to seize this moment. And you know what? We're not going to allow that. But the number of false reports of harassment, I just want to say, is tiny. Really, you look at the statistics, it's tiny. And that's because it's not usually worth, up until now, in terms of retaliation, to bring the complaint.
Yes, we'll come right over here.
I'm Jane Elizabeth. I'm the managing editor of the Raleigh News and Observer and the Durham Herald-Sun in North Carolina. To get back to Mizell's original question about what we're looking at this year, we have been taking a look at some of the questions we ask on our annual evaluations, which everyone I'm sure has in this room. And it's an interesting exercise if anybody wants to go back to their newsrooms and do this. But I want to interrupt myself for a minute and just say, if you work for a legacy news organization, a legacy newspaper, it is very hard to get rid of the assholes because you have a legacy of hiring assholes. That was a job requirement at one point in time. It's like, this guy's a jackass. Let him cover the White House. Or, it really was. And then you have the jackass pipeline, and it continues today. It's not like working for a startup when you can start by not hiring assholes. But so your evaluations are really important, right? So I have looked at ours, and we did change a few things this year. And so you can look at it with an eye towards what in here addresses the quality of jackassery, or whatever. I don't know the term for that. But so we have eagerness to learn new things, customer service. How many people have customer service in the newsroom on your evaluations? But the way your employees treat people on the phone is very indicative of how they're going to treat you also. Positive work environment. Let me see, I have to scroll down a little bit. High journalistic standards, teaching and training. If you have a person who is willing to share their knowledge with younger people, you probably don't have much of an asshole on your hands. So instead of focusing on AP style rules and clarity of writing, writes a good lead, maybe have some of these really, really important and urgent things in there.
And that's a really important point, because I don't know how many times over the years, I've gone into a new newsroom in a leadership role, and whenever a new leader comes into the room, all of the problems that preceded you come into your office in about the first week.
Yep.
And so-and-so has been like this for I don't know how long. And so, of course, my first question is, show me the evaluations. And so they bring me the evaluations, and I read the evaluations, and the evaluations are absolutely silent on this litany of misbehavior that people are bringing to me. So and when you're pursuing cases at the EEOC, if somebody's not keeping book on behavior, what happens? Nothing. Correct?
Probably. I mean, in any legal case, right, you can accuse someone, but you've got to prove it. I mean, and so, in any legal matter, it's all a question of what is there that can prove it. Now, certainly testimony from individuals can make a big difference, and, we certainly in our investigations, whether it's on a harassment complaint or any type of discrimination complaint, spend a lot of time interviewing witnesses, looking at whatever documentary evidence. So it's an evaluation of the sum total of what the evidence is.
Yeah, I would say it's not going to affect the strength of our case. It might really affect the defense for the employer, right? Because we're talking to all the witnesses, and we asked them what happened. We asked if they complained. They might say we complained. And then now we're looking at, the employer has to show it took reasonable action after a complaint. If there's no action, in fact, there's nothing in the evaluation that reflects that, that employer is going to be worse off in terms of when they're dealing with, well, us or me up 2 weeks ago.
Absolutely. We have about 5 minutes, and so we're going to we're going to go to one more question, and then I'm going to have a final question for our panelists. So.
Kathleen Graham, the Executive Director of the Society for Advancing Business Editing and Writing. You had asked what has changed, and I originally was thinking we have so much work to do, but the things that I've observed in the past year through the things that we've done at Cebu is having more men involved in the conversation from a leadership perspective, more men coming to events like this, raising their hand. It's not just women saying, hey, we should be doing something about Me Too in the newsroom, but men of real character standing up. And the conversation has turned from what is legal to what is ethical. And I think that that's a good start, but there's a lot to do in that area. And the other thing that I would say, an area where we really need to grow, when I look at young business journalists going out into the financial services to cover stories, it's often dominated by men's sources, and making sure that young journalists who are out in the field are getting supported when they're being harassed by sources. And I think that that's an area for real growth for this project and for newsrooms.
Thank you for that. Now, I would be remiss if we did not address the current political climate and its impact on the EEOC. Vicki, you're working. Your senior leadership team is working. Everybody else is affected in your organization is affected by the shutdown. You yourself are the acting chair. Is that having, besides, obviously the shutdown is having is having an impact. But when we talk about vacancies on the commission and what has been happening in the current political environment, how has that affected your ability to fulfill the mission of the EEOC?
Well, in terms of the shutdown, the EEOC, we're part of the Commerce, Justice, Science Annual Appropriations Bill, so we are currently subject to the lapse in appropriations. I just came from a meeting with some colleagues from the Labor Department and other sort of labor and employment-oriented agencies. They all got funded as part of the labor HHS bill, but we're not. So we are, myself, the essential employees, a number of us who are exempted. And we are, through all of our offices, we have 53 offices around the country, we are able to accept if people want to file charges because they've got to timely file their charges. So we are, our contingency plan is people are able to file those charges so that they wouldn't time out. So that's in place. The leadership at the commission, we are a commission. We are a bipartisan commission. So we are now 2 commissioners, myself as the acting chair and Commissioner Charlotte Burrows. And that means we don't have a quorum. So we, right before the Senate session expired, took some steps to address internally some delegations so that the commission, once we are actually back at work as a full commission, then the work of the commission in terms of things that would otherwise have to be voted on, that can still happen. But the commission, the commissioners, are the policymaking group at the commission, and we have a long history of working in a bipartisan fashion. But there is an impact when you don't have a full complement of people to work with and to be able to advance a policy agenda.
And one of the reasons there's not a full complement, President Trump renominated you to the commission, and a single senator decided that he didn't want you back on the commission. Can you expand on what happened there?
Well, it's a bipartisan commission, right? So I'm one of the Democratic commissioners. The policy, the precedent is that the leader of that party just sends over a recommendation to the White House. So Senator Chuck Schumer essentially suggested my nomination to the Trump administration, and in November 2017, I was nominated for a 3rd term on the commission. The other tradition is you sort of package people for a bipartisan commission. So in December 2017, I had the support of lots of Republicans, including the Republican chair of the relevant committee. So there was a package of me and the person named to be the new chair and the other Republican. And at the time, Senator Mike Lee from Utah objected, so it did not go through as unanimous consent in December 2017. And for this whole year, there has been an effort to address that, because the EEOC hasn't had a Republican majority since the beginning of the Trump administration, which the business community very much wanted to see. So there was a lot of effort to get my nomination together with the other two through. But that did not happen. In fact, Senator Mike Lee took to the Senate floor to describe a person that I did not recognize, even though it was supposedly me, and Senator Patty Murray sort of saying why this was important not just for me, but for the EEOC. But I mean, I think the important thing is the EEOC will continue to operate. You know, in terms of taking in charges, in terms of trying to help people as soon as the government reopens, they'll be able to. And that's the important thing. I mean, we started a conversation. I feel so proud that I was able to work with my Republican colleague, and we have worked well in a bipartisan manner for 9 years. And we started a conversation, and we started an effort. And I don't plan to leave this field. You know, I mean, I had an offer to go back to teach at Georgetown Law School. I told the dean I'd let him know by January 14th. And yesterday I sent him an email saying, thanks so much, I'm not coming back because I just want to stay part of this process. I want to be out there helping employers actually put this in practice. You know?
And with that, we do need to wrap up. But let me, first of all, just thank Vicki and Hai for joining us today. We were just so privileged to have you and for you to be a part of this effort. And thank you for your leadership on this effort as well.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you.